with all of you. I invite you to open your Bibles to John chapter 10. And we're going to use a passage in that chapter in just a moment to frame what we're looking at for the next few days. I'd say that got here about a half hour before we started. And seeing everybody unpack all the chairs and get everything set up is something that I admire about a group of people willing to start a new work in an area that needs a work like this, the willingness to go through the difficulties and inconveniences of doing that kind of work for the gospel's sake speaks well to a church. And it's always good to be back in this area. I had talked to Wayne a few weeks ago, maybe a few months ago, I don't know, about the different topics that we could be looking at for these next few days. And he wanted me to talk on these things that we'll be sort of introducing tonight. But I'll tell you where my mind is with regards to why I thought this would also be a good series of lessons for this part of the country. My mom grew up in Silver Springs, and my grandpa worked for Ronald Reagan. And whenever they all moved to Minnesota, my mom and dad got married, and they had 3 kids. I'm the third one. I grew up in a skeptical family. Family that did not believe in the Bible. We weren't really sure that God existed. And every other week, while I was in high school, I would get breakfast with my grandpa, the one that worked for Ronald Reagan. And he always had a lot of skepticism towards the Bible, and this was before I really started seeking after God and seeking to know Him. But he grew up learning some things about the Bible, and he would bring up things and questions he had about the Bible that didn't make sense to him. And so my exposure to people from Maryland was highly educated people, very smart people who were skeptics. And whenever I've been here from time to time, talking with people in the community, going to the bookstores and seeing what kind of books a place like this in the country wants to read, in my mind I have that this is a group of people in this city, this area, this part of the country that generally speaking is pretty highly educated and thinks that they've got all kinds of good reasons on why they don't believe in God and they don't believe in Christianity. And here's a church that is trying to start out in this part of the country, trying to do evangelism in an area where people are too smart for the Lord. And that just seems like a really daunting task. And so I commend you guys for wanting to do that kind of work. What I want to do tonight, tomorrow, and Sunday is share with you some things that I've learned in some Bible studies that I've done with skeptics and atheists. This is not going to be the traditional apologetics kind of stuff that maybe you've heard before in some Bible classes. I think that stuff is great. There's a time and place for all of that sort of thing. But I've tailored the lessons that I did with skeptics for a Christian audience for 2 basic reasons. Number 1, to equip all of us to think about the worldview that we have as Christians, and to be emboldened in the fact that we have good answers for the things that people in a city like this, and in any skeptical area, might be asking. But another reason why I want to talk about some of these kinds of things is to, at the same time, challenge every one of us. Are you really trying to find your meaning in life from God? Is that functionally, every day, what's going on in your life? Or are you trying to find your meaning in life, or your sense of morality, or your sense of hope? Have you borrowed from a lot of other worldviews, and are you really purely serving God the way that He's asked you to? Now, for the framework of what we're looking at, I want us to look at John chapter 10, and look at verses 10 to 13 as we get started here. John chapter 10, verses 10 to 13. The thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. I came that they may have life and have it abundantly. I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. He who is a hired hand and not a shepherd, who does not own the sheep, sees the wolf coming and leaves the sheep and flees, and the wolf snatches them and scatters them. He flees because he is a hired hand and cares nothing for the sheep. One of the things that the Bible teaches, and the Bible would say things like this in Romans chapter 6, that all of us are enslaved to something. All of us are guided by something. And the way that Jesus talks about the two things that you can be guided by in this passage is either the good shepherd, or the thief, or he's called the hired hand. Now, what is life like under the hired hand or the thief? If you've not made Jesus your shepherd, that means that things in your life are being stolen from you. There are things like a need for meaning, a need for hope. There's need for forgiveness. You've got this burden of guilt. That there's so many deep needs that you have that are just being snatched away from you. And the contrast in this passage in verse 10 is that if Jesus is the one that's guiding you, he's going to give you life and give it abundantly. Now, if you were to see somebody at a bridge and they were about to jump off a bridge, would you just think to yourself, you know what, I don't think there's any good reason in trying to convince that person to not do that, because gravity is true for me, but it might not be true for that person. We all know that gravity is universally true for everybody. Here's a universal truth that the Bible teaches. If Jesus is not your shepherd, you don't have an abundant life. You just don't. And I think that one of the things that we as Christians need to help people realize is that the thing you're following, non-Christian, is something that's stealing and killing and destroying you. Now, we'll work our way towards how we would reason those things with somebody. But I want to start out by looking at some statistics in the United States. And the statistics that I'm going to show you about religious decline are dealing only with the United States. This is not true in other countries. But in 2019, Pew Research, they had some research that they did because that's what they do. And it says, in the United States, decline of Christianity continues at a rapid pace. And it talked in that article about religiously unaffiliated people. And that would be atheists, agnostic, or people that are religiously indifferent. In 2009, that was 17% of the United States population. But then in 2019, that jumped up to 26%. So 1 in 4 people, average across the United States that you meet, are not going to be religiously interested. And that was a few years ago. Gallup poll, March 2021, said that less than 50% of Americans belong to a church. And they said in that article that the decline in church membership is primarily a function of the increasing number of Americans who express no religious preference. Okay, so that's really scary, but here's even scarier. Pew Research in September of 2022 said this, that if recent trends in religious switching continue, in other words, people going from religion to non-religion, Christians could make up less than half the United States population within a few decades. Now, I understand that this one brought up 50% of people don't belong to a church. A lot of those would still identify as Christian, and so that would be why some of these numbers seem like they couldn't work together. But here's a question that I have. And we could look at more statistics, and you know what? You didn't even need those statistics to know that our country is becoming less and less interested in religion. So here's the question. What's the reason for this? Why is this happening? And there's a lot of different things that people might point to. They might point to the government. They might point to the schools. They might point to Hollywood. There's all kinds of things that you could point to that, seem to indicate this sort of thing. If you read or talk to some skeptics, you'll find them saying things like this. Richard Dawkins, famous atheist, and here's what he said in his most recent book. Outside Western Europe, where only a minority nowadays are religious, most people around the world still do believe in a god or gods, especially if they aren't well educated in science. Do you see any snootiness to that, perhaps? In those poor countries where they don't have good colleges and stuff like that, that's where you're going to find people that don't believe in God. They think that believing in the Bible is a superstitious kind of thing. In fact, the prevailing mindset that people have had for the last 60 or 70 years in this country is that the more science we have, the more that science can accomplish, the less we're going to need God, because science can answer a lot of the questions that people used to need God for, because it can answer a lot of the mysteries, things like that. Have you guys ever talked with people before that said, well, you know, the reason that I'm not a believer, the reason I don't believe in the Bible is because I've learned some things, and you're the ones that have your heads buried in the sand. All right. That's what I want to challenge here in this lesson. And by the way, in this series of lessons, normally what I'll do whenever I'm traveling and preaching is dig into Scripture. What we're going to do for these lessons is I'm going to show you a lot of quotes from skeptics and then respond to those quotes from the Bible. So I'm going to give us a context for why things that maybe you've always known in the Bible matter in our cultural context right now. All right, so if what the skeptic says is that I'm like Spock and I've used intellectual reasoning and that's why I'm not a Christian, is that really what's going on for every skeptic? I would challenge that and argue that there are not just intellectual reasons people think they have for not believing, but there's emotional reasons people have for not being a Christian. By the way, are you okay acknowledging that you have emotional reasons for being a Christian? That wouldn't be everything. But part of being a human being is having intellect and emotions. And where the skeptic likes to try to portray himself or herself is that I'm all intellect. I got no emotion in why I'm not a believer. Look at some reasons that people would not believe that I think stem from an emotional cause. Here's one of them, is a desire to sin. And I'm not suggesting that everybody that's a skeptic, that this is exactly what's going on in their heart. But it would be naive to say that that's never the case for somebody. In fact, I'll show you a quote from an atheist named Aldous Huxley. And look at this quote that he has here. For myself, the philosophy of meaninglessness, and we're going to talk more about that tomorrow. But what he's saying here is I have a view of the world that says that there is no God, and that there's no ultimate meaning to life, because no God has assigned it to me. So, the philosophy of meaninglessness was essentially an instrument of liberation. The liberation we desired was simultaneously liberation from a certain political and economic system and liberation from a certain system of morality. We objected to the morality because it interfered with our sexual freedom. All right, so here's Aldous Huxley. And he's got all of these really sophisticated reasons why he's not a believer, and he could throw all those arguments in front of you and you go, oh no, I need to go read some apologetics books to be able to know how to answer Sir Huxley. And he says here in this quote in his book, Means and Ends, that the reason I have these philosophies is because it had a moral attraction. It would allow me to do whatever I wanted to do politically, sexually, and because I had these base desires, I came up with these really sophisticated arguments to justify these things I wanted to do. Does the Bible teach that that's going to be one of the reasons for skepticism? This is seen in the false teachers. 2 Peter chapter 2, it talks about scoffers coming in the last days with scoffing, following their own sinful desires. They will say, where is the promise of his coming? For ever since the fathers fell asleep, all things are continuing as they were from the beginning of creation. Scoffers, and they've got these arguments. Hey, you guys think that there's going to be a final judgment day? Well, look at how many things have just kind of continued as they were. You really think that there's going to be a big God in the sky that's going to reach his hand down and eventually judge? It doesn't seem to fit what we see happening throughout history. So you're saying that that's just randomly going to happen one day? All right, why are they coming up with these arguments? Sinful desires. How many of you have had times before where you saw some argument online, you heard some argument from a friend, and they brought up something that sounded really sophisticated and really intimidating, and you thought that the way I was going to reason with this person is just argue every point back to them? Do you realize that that might be too shallow of a way to respond? And there might be something deeper going on. I'll tell you, the first time that this really struck me, I was meeting with a guy at a church in Minnesota, and he wanted to get together because he wasn't sure if he believed the Bible anymore. And he had this reason for it and that reason for it, and it all sounded really intimidating. And there was something about the way he was saying everything, and I don't remember what it was, that made me think that there was something else going on. And so I said, okay, well, I think there's really great answers to all of those questions that you have. But let me ask you this first. Is there something that the Bible teaches that you don't like? Guess where the real conversation was? The really intellectual stuff that sounds really sophisticated, or there's this base desire that I have, and I want to be able to do that without feeling like a hypocrite. Can I just say I don't believe in this? That's where the real conversation was. Now that's one emotional reason for being a skeptic. Here's another one. Is some kind of a bad religious experience. Now, whenever I moved from California to Atlanta, one of the things that people can do evangelistically, I don't know if you guys have ever tried this here, there's a website called meetup.com. And anybody can create any group. You have to pay like $200 a year for it or something like that. But you can create a hiking group, you can create a free thinkers group, you can create a bowling group, and anybody that has those interests can peruse which groups exist on the website and then attach themselves to one of the groups. And whenever that group says, hey, we're going to meet and bowl on such and such a day, they get a notification. So I created a meetup group in Atlanta for skeptics to have Bible studies. And we would get around a big table at a coffee shop. And the first question that I would ask is, I would say, I'm Eric, I'm a Christian, and then what's your name and what do you identify as? Not the gender thing. But like, what do you identify as philosophically, religiously, or whatever? And there would be like, an ex-Muslim who is now a secular humanist. There's somebody that, used to be a Catholic and now they're an atheist. And we would just kind of go around. And whenever I would ask that question, hey, what's your name? What are you religiously or philosophically? People would just answer that question without any emotion, just straight facts. Then the second question that I would ask them, and we would go around the circle, is tell me about your religious background. As soon as I would ask that question, that's where people started to show how frustrated they were. And I'd hear stories like, I grew up in a family that drugged me to church all the time, but mom and dad were always fighting. People in the church were hypocrites. And it didn't seem like anybody really loved each other. And I just am sick of all of that sort of thing. So every time I try to go to a church building, I've got too much of a bad taste in my mouth from my previous experiences. By the way, like quick time out and side point about that. Have you ever seen in the Gospels the theme of the crowds? There's times like in Mark chapter 2, where there's Mr. Paralyzed Man, and he's got 4 friends that are bringing him to this house. And there's this crowd that's in the way. Do you remember what Mr. Paralyzed friends do for him? They go up the roof, open up the roof, and drop him down to Jesus. They have to overcome the crowd to get to Jesus. Do you remember in Mark chapter 5, where Jesus is on his way to heal this man Jairus' daughter that was about to die, and then she did die? And on the way, there was Mrs. Bleeding for 12 years woman. And this woman reaches out and she touches Jesus, and then immediately she's healed. But do you remember Jesus' question there? Who touched me? And the disciples say, well, everybody's touching you. What kind of question is that? Well, what's the answer to that, by the way? She had to excuse me her way through a crowd of people. And she was the only one who reached out by faith. Do you know what people of faith do? They can look past the crowd and see the treasure of Christ. Whenever anybody has got a bad religious experience, and they use that as a reason to not follow the Lord, you're not looking at the treasure of Jesus. Now, and we still got to talk about your bad religious experience. Maybe other people say, I thought God was going to give me this or that, and I kept praying for it, and it never happened. Do you see how, so far, these 2 reasons, desire to sin, bad religious experience, is that because you've become Spock and you're just really intellectual? Or are those emotionally driven reasons to not believe? Notice the third one. Social pressure. Can you imagine living in the 1500s and walking around the streets saying, I declare me atheist. I'm an atheist, everybody. And everybody's going to stone you or something. Or you're not going to be able to buy, sell, or trade anymore because it was kind of baked into society that you believe in God, oftentimes in a superstitious kind of way. But we live in a culture now where it's more accepted and praised to break the shackles of something like ancient religion. And this can come in the form of peers, parents, or professors. I don't know if any of you ever had college professors that tried to dissuade you from believing God. When I became a Christian, my parents had all kinds of problems with it. Every day I would come home from school, they had new stacks of documents on my desk in my room trying to tell me why the Bible's not reliable. That was my teenage rebellion. I had some friends when I was in 8th grade, believe it or not, and these friends were interesting because you know how a lot of people have like a TV in their living room? This family had like 5 computers in their living room because it was 4 boys and the mom worked with computers. So like they all had those chairs that had the wheels on it, and you know you could like swing back from one computer to another. So one kid would pull up something funny on their computer, and then they would all like move their chairs over and look, and then they would think that was really cool, and then they would all swing over to the other side and look at what else somebody else. So there's one time I was at their house. It was really a strange family. There's one time where one of them pulled up a bar graph, some kind of a graph, that showed that the more educated you are, the less likely you are to be a Christian. And we all thought that was hilarious, because what kind of people are Christians? The dumb ones. And we're like, oh yeah, that's real funny, we really know better. How about this? What is the explanation for that? Why is it the case that more educated people oftentimes are unbelievers? Maybe it has more to do with social pressure, peer pressure. You want to be the one guy or girl in your biology class where every time the teacher says something against the Bible, are you going to be the one that keeps raising your hand and everybody around you, hey, you know, do you agree with what the professor's saying? Oh yeah, I surely do. I wouldn't want to be thought of as one of those dumb people. I think it has more to do with peer pressure than it does enlightened thinking. And so if these are the common reasons for skepticism, what do we do to reason with people? And by the way, I'm sure there's people here that have got coworkers, friends, maybe family members, that if you were to peel back the layers, you'd find that there's an emotional reason for their unbelief. Is there something that the Bible teaches that you don't like? Tell me about your religious experience. Tell me about some of your closest friends and whether or not they're religious. How do we reason with people like this in our culture? And I'm going to present to you 2 approaches to dealing with skeptics. And this is going to get us into the context of what we look at more precisely for the next couple of days. But one approach that you could do when reasoning with people that are skeptics like this is what you could call objective evidences. Objective meaning there are arguments outside of yourself, arguments from archaeology, arguments from logic, arguments from history that shows that the Bible's trustworthy, things like that. So when somebody asks a question like, how do we know for sure God exists? How do we know that the Bible's reliable? You know, there's a lot of cool things that you could bring up. Like one thing that people used to say was that David was no more historical than King Arthur. That's what an atheist said at one point. And you go, okay, well I can show you all the reasons why David was a real person. There's an obelisk that was found in 1993. That's what they wrote on back then. And this obelisk was written by a pagan king when Hazael, king of Syria, defeated Joram. And part of this thing says this: I slew mighty kings who harnessed thousands of chariots and thousands of horsemen. I killed the king of the house of David. Now this would have taken place a couple hundred years after David. But when this discovery was made in 1993, guess what argument skeptics stopped making? That David was not a real person. Actually, this sort of shows that he was a real person. So there you go, skeptic. Will you believe now? I remember the first time I did a study with atheists and skeptics in Atlanta. And the first thing that I did with a group of people at a Chick-fil-A, I thought it was funny that I did it at a Chick-fil-A. We were meeting at a Chick-fil-A, and I showed them arguments for the resurrection of Christ. And none of those people came back again. By the way, they were good arguments, really good. But there was, and made me retool and go, there's something else going on. Here's another kind of argument that people might use. Okay, somebody says, I don't know that I believe in the existence of God. Here's a great argument to show somebody that God exists. Okay, so you start out by saying, the universe. Do you believe that it exists or it doesn't exist? By the way, people think that we're just living in a dream. Those people are called solipsists. I've never met a real solipsist to this day. Get it? All right, so the universe, does it exist? Yeah, it exists. All right, so it either had no beginning or a beginning. And most people would say, well, yeah, it had a beginning at some point. All right, great. So we're on the same team so far. We both believe the universe exists. We both believe it had a beginning. So either the beginning was caused by nothing or it was caused by something. Okay, so you think something caused it too. Cool. So either that something was non-personal, like some kind of cosmic accident, or it was some kind of personal being that has intelligence, which would then lead you to God. So if you don't believe that God exists, then you either believe that the universe doesn't exist, or if it does exist, it had no beginning, nothing caused it, and a non-personal accident caused it. Now, do you think that's a pretty good argument to bring up? I think that's a great argument to bring up somebody. But here's the problem. In our cultural context right now, how many people do you know that are totally objective-minded? Where they just really let the facts take them where they should go? Scientifically speaking, how many are there? 2. So the people that say that there's more than 2, are they being driven by objective facts and data or something else? Think of another example like abortion. And both my wife and I came from non-Christian families, and some of our family members have had abortions. I think one of the things that needs to be talked about whenever abortion gets brought up from a pulpit is that it can always be forgiven. Amen. But is it terminating a human life? Scientifically, that's what it is. And if you believe anything else, it's not because you're being driven by objective facts and data. So, have you ever had a time before where you tried reasoning with somebody about their skepticism with objective arguments? And it was just like butting heads. I don't know where to go from here. Okay, maybe we need another tool in this cultural context that we live in to deal with people that have emotional reasons for their unbelief. And so that's where we talk about what we're going to talk about for the rest of this weekend, subjective evidences. You know, when people talk about evangelism, people talk about, have you ever heard people use the phrase before, that you've got to meet people where they're at? And oftentimes what people mean by that is you got to meet them where they're at, is they've got such and such a question, so let's deal with that question. Sure. But if all you do is just answer their questions and never discern where the questions are coming from, are you really meeting them where they're at? Somebody's wondering, should I really believe in the Bible? Okay, well, here's 5,000 reasons to believe in the Bible. Okay, you satisfied now? Well, not really. Okay, so maybe we got to peel back and see what's the emotional cause for your unbelief, and look within yourself and try to reason from emotional reasons to believe in God. What I do when I study with the skeptics then is reason with them and show that Christianity makes more emotional sense than a secular worldview. You remember that time when Jesus was with the woman at the well in John chapter 4? And here's a woman that's been married 5 times. She's shacking up with a 6th guy. What has she been trying to find fulfillment in, it seems? Seems like relationships, if we can read that into it. She's gone from one to another, and then she's got this question to Jesus about, where is the right place to worship? I'm kind of skeptical on where the right place is. And one of the things that Jesus says to this woman in this context deals with her deep needs that can only be satisfied in the Lord. Whoever drinks of the water that I will give him will never be thirsty again. Notice that with this woman, Jesus is not giving her 5,000 reasons this, 5,000 reasons that. He pierces right through to the heart and says subjectively, within yourself. Let's not just look at objective arguments. Let's look in your own heart for a moment. There are certain things that you know you need in your life. But you've been following the thief that's been stealing and killing and destroying you. Remember, the angriest I have ever seen my father was after my wife and I got married, and after we got married, we moved down to Nashville, and a few months later, my brother got engaged, and we had to go back up to Minnesota for the wedding. And on the day that Samantha and I were leaving back to Minnesota, my dad brought up a passage in Deuteronomy, and he yelled at the top of his lungs, about how ridiculous he thought the Bible was because of a specific passage in Deuteronomy. And I started crying, and I looked at him, and I said, Dad, you're walking away and you're rejecting the only thing that will ever satisfy you. You are allowing yourself to be stolen and killed and destroyed. There's only one thing that you can draw from and drink from and be nourished by that's actually going to satisfy you. Now, how do you tease that out for somebody? What are some of the deep needs that we have as human beings? You could ask yourself the question, which worldview best fits these particular needs? And this is what we're going to look at the next couple of days. Our need for meaning, our need for morality, and our need for hope. Now, when I have done these studies with skeptics, I've extended this out to more needs. But here's what we're going to do tomorrow and Sunday morning, is we're going to look at how skeptics have tried to find meaning in life. And I've read a lot from atheists, and I've taken the best quotes that I can find from them that accurately represent what they really believe. We look at what they have said, and then we deconstruct it, and then show how Jesus is a better shepherd. So as we look at these different needs, you can ask yourself, which of these worldviews, secularism or Christianity, which one of them fits my deepest needs? Here's another question that you could ask yourself. Looking at these needs that we have, which worldview best makes sense of the world that we live in? And I'll give you one teaser to this. Let's say that you're talking to a skeptic who believes that our morality, which we'll talk more about, Lord willing, on Sunday morning, that our morality is derived from the animal kingdom. You can look at how some monkeys take care of other monkeys. You can look at how some birds feed their little birds and they watch out for each other. And from that, you can derive that evolution has created the morality that we have. All right, so basically what you're saying is this. Your worldview is that we came about from the strong eating the weak. And somehow you also believe in equal human rights. Do you see that that does not... It's great that you believe in equal human rights. It's awesome that you believe it, but you, Mr. or Mrs. Atheist, have to believe that by faith, because your worldview doesn't give that to you. So you're asking yourself the question, which worldview makes the best sense of the things that I see around me? And so in this way, we're looking at what I like to call subjective evidences. It's not objective. It's not all these arguments for the reason for God and the Bible, but it's looking within myself. I have got things that I need. And so what we're doing is we're prodding people and going, have you really thought about your meaning in life? Have you really thought about why you're concerned about morality? I'm glad you do, but have you thought about why you do? Have you thought about the hope that you have after you die? C.S. Lewis said this in Mere Christianity. Creatures are not born with desire unless satisfaction for those desires exists. A baby feels hunger, there is such a thing as food. A duckling wants to swim, there is such a thing as water. If I find in myself a desire which no experience in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that I was made for another world. And if none of my earthly pleasures satisfy it, that does not prove that the universe is a fraud. Probably earthly desires were never meant to satisfy it, but only to arouse it, to suggest the real thing. You know what kind of people are all around you in your workplaces or in your family if they're non-Christian? Are people that are trying to be satisfied and fulfilled by their career, by their education, by their family. And that would be like the more accepted forms of idolatry. There would be the obvious ones like sexual immorality and drunkenness and whatever people do that people say are the big bad sins and all that sort of thing. All around you, you got people that are trying to feed off of things that are just exploiting them. If I can show somebody why it's in their best interest to believe in Christianity, there's a guy that Dylan and I have been studying with from Malaysia. And one of the questions that I've been asking him as we've been studying is, do you want Christianity to be true? For a while, he wasn't sure if he wanted it to be true. And I knew that the day that would come, when the day came when he said, yes, I want it to be true, I would know that something has clicked within him, that he sees the beauty of Jesus. And he sees that it would be nice if it were true, but I'm still not sure if it is true. If that can click for somebody and they want it to be true, guess what they're ready for then? The classic evidences for why God exists, why the Bible is true. Then they're ready to have those questions answered. But if I just start out by showing somebody who's not even sure if they want it to be true, this reason and that reason and that reason, and we live in a culture that's not objectively driven, I'm not meeting them where they're at. A couple of years ago, I talked to somebody who grew up in a Christian family. And his father was an elder in a church. He had other kids that were believers, but this son had become an atheist. And the father wanted me to call him and reach out to him. And so I called him and I said, so tell me about what you've been wrestling with in the Bible. And he said, well, I'm not sure that I believe that God exists, and here's my reasons. And I've really been struggling with this. And so my first question to him was, I said, you used the word struggle. That's a pretty active word, struggle. Can you explain to me what your struggle has looked like? What have you been doing to try to find answers to these questions? Because you're not the first person in 2,000 years to ask these questions. And guess what his struggle looked like? Well, there was one time where I pulled aside one of the members of the church and I asked them these questions, and I didn't feel like his answers were very satisfactory. Okay, all right. How long ago was that? I think that was about 6 months ago. To which I responded, I'm not sure that you're struggling. Because that doesn't sound like a struggle to me. What that sounds like to me is a justification to, in his case, keep watching porn and not have to feel guilty about it. Ask yourself right now, if there's any skepticism within you, if there's been something that you've been wondering and bothered about in Scripture, and you're thinking to yourself, I'm not sure if this is really true. I'm not sure if I really want to believe this. I don't know if I really want to commit to this. Ask yourself and be honest. Is there something that the Bible teaches that you don't like? Have you had some kind of bad religious experience? Do you have friends that are pressuring you against this? And then ask yourself, are you really being driven by evidence? Or is there more emotional things going on and you've not thought about the emotional appeals to Christianity? So starting tomorrow night, we're going to look at our need for meaning. Everybody needs to have a meaning in life. How do skeptical people find meaning in life? How does the biblical worldview give you meaning in life? And that's what we're going to be looking at starting tomorrow. I thank you for your good attention. We're about to sing a song. And if anybody has any follow-up questions, I understand that our time for these next couple days is shorter, but we're going to have a potluck and stuff tomorrow. Please pull me aside and ask me any specific questions that you might have, because I'm not going to be able to get to everything that we can talk about in these 4 sessions. But thank you for your good attention. Look forward to this time together. Everybody can stand while we sing the song that Wayne has selected.
This world is not my home, I'm just a